Hey everybody, this is a section from the introduction by Pietro Basso uh, to the Science and Passion of Communism, selected writings of Amadeo Bordiga. It's on the Russian question. I'm skipping. I could read this entire introduction, which is quite long. Not like an intro, like the entire introduction that this selection is from. But for my purposes, which is on critical receptions of the USSR and the Western left, um, I'm trying to get a feel for what Bordiga's opinions on the Soviet Union are in greater depth, kind of looking at the secondary literature on that topic. Um, so here we go. I cannot, of course, deal here with all the themes in Amadeo Bordiga's 20-plus volumes of writings, which, apart from repeatedly focusing in depth on the history of the workers' movement and revolutions, range from history to anthropology, economics to physics, the agrarian question to ecology and militarism, and the remote past of, quote, primitive societies, one of the passions and interests he had in common with Marx, to the communist future. As in the selection of texts for this anthology, I shall concentrate on a few areas where Bordiga's contribution as a communist theorist was and is fundamental and advance of his times. From this point on, post-war social developments will therefore remain somewhat in the background, and since in no respect was Bordiga's experience as a political leader in the 1912 to 26 period repeated in the years after the Second World War. For the same reason, I will say little about Italy, although the small group of mostly Italian comrades active around Bordiga after 1951 to 52 included some working-class nuclei. They were in effect a working group, a research community, we might say, engaged in the production and to a limited extent dissemination of Programma Comunista, but lacking a real field of political intervention. Their function in practice was to accompany and support the titanic effort of theoretical analysis and updating of the foundations of Marxism that was carried out almost exclusively by Bordiga, although, as we shall see, they did not always absorb the results of his labors. Footnote. In this sense, the claim of these comrades was well founded. See Amadeo Bordiga, Revolutionary Militant, Not Solitary Thinker, published in Programma Comunista, 1996. But I think Sajorio was also right when he wrote, quote, Bordiga was loved and worshipped by most of the comrades, but he was not understood because of the great distance that lay in many respects between himself and the others. Politically, too, the aptitude for understanding and growing is strengthened through exercise of the critical spirit, but this was not favored in Programma Comunista. We have seen that it is not forcing things to say that in it there was a, quote, ban on thinking with one's own head, end quote. Turco underlines a no less, end quote, end quote. Turco underlines a no less important aspect of Programma Comunista that caused a series of organizational rifts between the 1960s and 1982, quote, its inability to pass non-traumatically from the sphere of guiding principles to the practice of intervention in accordance with those principles, end quote. 1983. Essentially, that is, a pronounced weakness in politics. Evidently, Bordiga had some responsibility for all this, and we should not forget the enormous weight that social isolation always has in structuring relations inside small militant groups and their external activity. I wanted to look up Programma Comunista. So I couldn't find like that journal directly, but within yeah, I can't really find anything that's like directly about it. I'd have to look that up at some other time, because there's kind of information on it in the Italian Wikipedia, but it's like kind of located within um, the Wikipedia on like the Internationalist Communist Party, or whatever the exact wording of that party was. Um, and I don't know, I'd be jumping around, it'd be a mess. Anyway, end footnote. It is inevitable that we should begin with the complex and highly controversial, quote, Russian question. Marcel van der Linden, in his broad survey of Western Marxist analyses of developments in Soviet Russia, finds that Bordiga's position stands out in three respects. His, quote, striving to obtain a detailed empirical insight, end quote, his understanding of it not as a post-capitalist society, but as a society on the road to capitalism, and his reference to a, quote, idiosyncratic type of capitalism, end quote. Footnote, van der Linden, 2007. The quantity of often detailed factual material in Bordiga's writings on Russia is indeed impressive. They serve to support his thesis of a Russia in transition to capitalism, not from capitalism to socialism. In the context of state industrialism and a declining compromise with the peasantry paid for by the industrial proletariat. Footnote. Bordiga's chief writings on the subject are contained in the following volumes: Bordiga, 1976, 1990, 1975, 1977. And all these texts date back from the years between 1952 and 1959. His big text on that is not published in this book, which I think is unfortunate, for my purposes at least. And those are the only purposes that matter, let's be clear. This approach was methodologically bound to... end footnote. This approach was methodologically bound to contest in some form, though from a position of terrible isolation, the current apologetics for the, quote, fatherland of socialism, end quote. A veritable myth oriented to the most combative part of the proletariat internationally. Not only the workers organized in Togliatti's PCI. How can myths be debunked except by opposing the harsh reality to them? To wage such a battle, today undoubtedly won at a theoretical level, but then so much against the current that it seemed quixotic, it was essential to focus rigorously, taking Marxist thought as the basis, on the distinctive characteristics of the capitalist mode of production and distribution. This is what Linden called, rightly, a, quote, idiosyncratic conception, quote, of capitalism. It was also essential to explain, again clearly, in the face of the monstrous mystifications of, quote, actual socialism, what socialism and communism really were. Liliana Greeley has faithfully and perspicaciously, I can never say that word right, summarized the indefatigable effort on Bordiga's part, and I will follow her step by step. I don't know who this person is. It looks like there's an Amadeo Bordiga Foundation in Italy that this person is on. So I'm not really seeing anything for Liliana Greeley. All right, so here we go. The starting point that the Russian Revolution did not take place, quote, against capital, end quote, as Gramsci claimed, but in accordance with. Let me repeat that. The starting point that the Russian Revolution did not take place, quote, against capital, as in against Marx's capital, end quote, as Gramsci claimed, but in accordance with Marx's capital, is based on a complete reconstruction of Lenin's internationalist strategy, which saw the Russian Revolution as the first step in the world proletarian revolution, rather than assigning it the impossible task of immediately transforming the social economic relations in Russia in 1917 in a socialist direction. According to Bordiga, Lenin operated in a continuum going back to Marx and Engels. Lenin was fully aware that the revolution in Russia had a dual character, quote, socialist in politics and capitalist in economics, end quote. At the level of economics, all it could realistically aim to achieve was the modernization of the Russian economy by moving the Russian economy forward from parcelized petty commodity production in the countryside, parenthesis, with patriarchal residues, in parenthesis, towards state capitalism. Despite the existence of the Soviet regime, the development of state industry should not be misleadingly dressed up as socialist. Parenthesis, here the criticism of Trotsky is both implicit and explicit, end parenthesis. To be sure, it was a step towards socialism in the sense that the economy might be transformed in the future in a socialist direction, but nothing more. Greeley rightly argues that Bordiga presented and shared Lenin's strategy as centered on the promotion of socialist revolution elsewhere in the world. He felicitously combined, quote, great audacity in the political domain, end quote, with a, quote, extreme realistic moderation in the economic domain, end quote. This would be enough to clearly differentiate Bordiga's analysis and position from most of the Western communist left, which saw the new economic policy as formal confirmation of the straightforwardly bourgeois nature of the Russian Revolution. Bordiga defended the new economic policy after both world wars. Footnote. It should be noted that Bordiga maintained this defense at the Congress of the French Communist Party in Marseille, how do I say that? I think it's Marseille, in December 1921, where Bordiga was officially representing the Comintern. After the Second World War, Bordiga wrote, quote, it is one thing to criticize the reformism of the bourgeois state, another to fall prey to sentimental fancies and fail to see it the great forms of economy replace each other not in fits and starts, but by passing through long transitional periods, that it is pointless to deny or deprecate, as in the present case, quote, vile commerce, end quote, was despised by the, quote, patriarchal old Russian half aristocratic, half peasant, end quote, spirit. The socialist task then was to introduce bourgeois commerce, calling it aloud by both its first and family names, end quote. Bordiga. End footnote. Bordiga defended the new end footnote. More generally, Bordiga embraced the concept of, quote, slow, gradual development of the relations of production in Russia, end quote, admitting that it might pause on capitalist forms and even take, quote, steps back, end quote, to kindle them. What decided things positively or negatively was the course of the proletarian struggle worldwide, and in particular the victory or retreat of the proletarian revolution in Western Europe, where capitalism was already widely established and had laid the basis for socialist transformations in the economy. The key point in the Bolshevik internationalist strategy was the expectation of proletarian revolution in Europe. Thus, what happened in Russia is only really explicable by reference to the international context. The tension or acute contradiction in Russia between proletarian power in the hands of the Communist Party and an incipient capitalist economic structure was sustainable for a relatively long period. Parenthesis, Lenin speculated 10 to 20 years, end parenthesis, but only on condition that the social revolution did not beat a retreat outside Russia, and that the Russian Communist Party was not sucked in and nationalized by the Russian state. This is the reason why Bordiga insisted so much in 1925 to 26 on, quote, overturning the pyramid, end quote, so that the primacy of the international over the Russian party and of the Russian party over the Russian state was established or reestablished. That overturning did not happen. The strength of the world bourgeois counter-revolution was such that it forced the international into, first, a number of tactical concessions, and then into a reversal abandonment of its original revolutionary strategy through the adoption of the theory and politics of, quote, socialism in one country. A theoretical nonsense covering up a political defeat and then a political crime. Isolated from the Western proletariat, its natural ally, the Russian proletariat was trapped by economic and social forces that the development of the Russian economy in a capitalist direction constantly fueled, and deprived of any political autonomy through the crushing of the left opposition in the Bolshevik Party. As Stalinism became the hegemonic force in the international, Stalinism managed to give a counter-revolutionary direction to the entire workers' movement by means of a series of moves that began in 1926 and ended in active participation in the second great imperialist slaughter. Quote, it all went together, with a series of, quote, ideological renunciations of class antithetical positions on social, administrative, political, judicial, philosophical, and religious issues, end quote, which conspired to make of Stalinism a, quote, open and deadly sworn enemy of the working class and the working class's historical path to communism, end quote. See Greeley, oltre il mito, oltre il, quote, mito URS, yes, that's USSR in Italian, URSS, end quote, I capitale come, quote, forza sociale, end quote, e la abolizione del valore. In Cortesi, edited volume 1999, I have been drawing on this excellent article, itself a compendium and updating of the invaluable Greeley 1982. In these studies, Greeley notes that the works of Carr, Dobb, Bettelheim, and I would add Lewin, contain many useful elements confirming Bordiga's analysis, despite the diversity of ideological and political orientations. Yeah, I'm trying to see if there's anything. Yeah, I can't find anything for it. Sorry, I was trying to see if I could find that article, but I can't. Anyway, end footnote. Stalinism was revolutionary in performing the task of capitalist development in Russia, Stalinism was counter-revolutionary in Stalinism's adulteration of Marxist theory, Stalinism's reversal of the revolutionary strategy of the Comintern, Stalinism's liquidation of genuine communists, and Stalinism's donning of the, quote, mask of victorious socialism, end quote, to cover up its betrayal. But what actually happened to the socio-economic structure of Russia under Stalinist rule? The first part of Bordiga's answer refers to the persistence of the typical categories of a capitalist society: commodity, market, money, profit, wage, firm. Where these are alive and kicking, there cannot be socialism, and it's precisely with regard to these categories, particularly the firm or enterprise, that Bordiga's reconstruction is most illuminating. As Bordiga sees it, the key aspect is not the juridical one of state or private ownership of the enterprise and the means of production, but the fact that also in self-styled socialist Russia, all the activity of producing goods and services takes place through a multiplicity of enterprises, that is, distinct economic units with, quote, proper accounting, end quote, geared to profitability. And I think this is the position, and I think it was just mentioned that there is a verification of Bordiga's thesis in the works of Bettelheim. I think this is also like the thesis of Paresh Chattopadhyay and Shaul Bettelheim. They emphasize importantly, as opposed to a lot of Trotskyists like Cliff, and post-Trotskyists and post-Trotskyists like Cliff, Dunayevskaya, and James, and probably also council communist and social democratic critics of the USSR. Unlike those people, Chattopadhyay and Bettelheim make a big thing about of like the separation, the double separation of capitalism, the separation of the workers from the means of production, and also the separation of units of production. So this is interesting. I mean, I kind of already knew that, but let us proceed. Crucially, there is extraction of surplus value, and this appropriation takes place with the aim of parenthesis capital and parenthesis accumulation. State ownership or planning changes nothing in the capitalist framework of this economy. First of all, because the economically active state has been around for a long time in capitalist economies, so that statized economy equal to socialist economy is a false equation. Moreover, there is rather less of a really statized, fully nationalized economy in Russia than its rulers flaunt. Much of the activity of large-scale state industry is contracted out to small and medium-sized firms that have not been expropriated. Parenthesis, quote, that would be a crime, end quote, Stalin said, end parenthesis. In the picture in the countryside, which Bordiga subjects to a highly accurate investigation, points even more in the same direction. There, the state-run sovkhozy is definitely a minority phenomenon, overshadowed by the cooperative management, parenthesis, kolkhozy, end parenthesis, and small family plots, parenthesis, of which there are tens of millions, in parenthesis. And none of these three forms of organizing food production is socialist. The kolkhoz is neither fish nor fowl, comprising four social figures in one: small landowners running their own farms, wage laborers, enterprise stakeholders who receive a share of its profits, and collective landowners. Again, none of these relates to socialism. What we see rather is a, quote, sub-bourgeois, end quote, solution of the agrarian question, with a very large space for peasant individualism, especially after the campaign against the kulaks. Footnote: Bordiga observes, quote, the abolition of private land ownership is only apparent, parenthesis, and more so, as we shall see, in the case of housing and other property, end parenthesis, since the state may grant concessions to cooperative entities and private families. The only thing missing is, quote, alienability for money, end quote. But if, quote, usufruct is perpetual and irrevocable by the state, end quote, parenthesis, it suffices to pay a tax, end parenthesis, and can, quote, even be passed on as an inheritance, end quote, what we have is the, quote, full transformation of state ownership into cooperative ownership, parenthesis, large cult-cause enterprise, end parenthesis, in private ownership, parenthesis, family plots and houses, end parenthesis, end quote. Marx would say that, quote, like relations of production, there is like form of ownership, end quote. End footnote. Similarly, quote, socialist planning, the other great, quote, anti-capitalist boast of Stalinist propaganda, is certainly not planning of production ex ante, based on physical data and geared to, quote, enlargement of the producer's lives, end quote, and reduction of effort. The reality is simply ex post registration of what has already occurred through the, quote, spontaneous initiative of separate individual economic actors, parenthesis, enterprises, end parenthesis, plus a mere forecasting instrument for the future based on that registration process and oriented to higher production for the sake of production. Just as little can one regard as as a sign of socialism, the long-sustained growth of industrial output or the rise in labor productivity due to reductions in the size of the workforce. Indeed, once again, refuting official propaganda, Bordiga identifies in Russia the same historical tendency to a slowdown in output growth that can be seen in advanced capitalist countries. The economy of the, quote, fatherland of socialism, end quote, also follows the typical trajectory of a young capitalism that starts out with feverish growth rates at the expense of a, quote, underpaid, end quote, proletariat, and then slows down because of the general laws of capital accumulation laid bare by Marx, parenthesis, rising organic composition of capital, tendency of the rate of profit to fall, etc., end parenthesis. In Stalin's Russia, then, there is no trace of a socialist economy that has replaced production based on value with, quote, anti-commodity, anti-wage, and anti-enterprise, end quote, production, or is at least leading in that direction, nor does it make any sense to speak of a, quote, socialist market, end quote, which is a contradiction in terms. But, it may be asked, if this is a full-blown capitalist economy, where are the capitalists? Is what we see a capitalism without capitalists? Far from focusing on the state bureaucracy, which he regards as a false track, Bordiga's answer directs our attention to the enterprise. All regimes of class-divided societies have had a bureaucracy. This cannot be a class that stands on its own 2 feet. It simply serves the dominant class in a given social-economic formation. Footnote. It should be noted that Bordiga engaged in correspondence with Bruno Rizzi, author of The Bureaucratization of the World. See Saggiolo, 2014. End footnote. Therefore, it is necessary to look at the economic substructure of the enterprises. It is there in the interest networks thrown up by each enterprise in the radius of its own activity, that we can identify in Russia the agents of the impersonal power of capital, not only Russian but world capital, moreover, since, quote, Soviet Russia is not an island entire unto itself. In Russia, the bourgeoisie, in the bourgeoisie's classical form, the totality of individual private owners of enterprises, was destroyed by the revolution. But since the mechanism of enterprise commodity production was not destroyed, and since wage labor was not abolished, capital is presented there in new forms, as the social force that commands and exploits labor and appropriates labor products for the purpose of its own self-valorization. But since the mechanism of enterprise commodity production was not destroyed, and since wage labor was not abolished, capital is presented there in new forms, as the social force that commands and exploits labor and appropriates labor products for the purpose of its own self-valorization. Footnote. In a letter of the 9th of July, 1951, Bordiga wrote to Onorato Domin that one should proceed, quote, circumspectly with regard to, quote, present-day Russian society, end quote, since we are facing, quote, something historically new, end quote. The first case of a revolution that, quote, curls up on itself and disappears, end quote. Bordiga rejects Domin's idea that the USSR of the early 50s is a fully developed state capitalism. Quote, the most organic, clearly defined, and complete manifestation, end quote, of the tendency of the most advanced industrial countries toward, quote, ever greater state intervention, end quote, a kind of historical vanguard along that road. For Bordiga, Russia is simply tending towards, full, capitalism, not the last word in capitalist development. That is why Bordiga thinks the formulation, quote, state industrialism, end quote, or large-scale state industrialism is the most appropriate way to describe it. End footnote. Although state ownership of the means of production, labeled, quote, socialist, end quote, no less, end in large-scale industry has mystified the web of enterprise interests marked by typically capitalist, quote, social vampirism, end quote. That web will sooner or later come to, quote, admit that it is capitalist and to demand less complicated institutional forms so that it can function more efficiently and expeditiously. Then the confessed functionaries of capital, too, will become a more evident physical presence. The 20th Congress of the CPSU, Bordiga notes, was a, quote, huge leap, end quote, in this direction. The rest will come, including a dash by enterprises to shake off the already rather loose central controls. Well, what else happened with the advent of Gorbachev's perestroika? Where did tens of thousands appear from in a flash, eager to apply the new shibboleth of enterprise, quote, autonomy, self-sufficiency, self-finance, and self-management, end quote? Which long-term processes generated the Yeltsin-era sharks of wild privatization and sellouts to the West, if not the, quote, interest networks, end quote, consolidated in decades of false socialism and perceptively identified by Bordiga. Footnote. Turco in 1992 updates to December 1991 Bordiga's analysis of Russia and complements it with some general considerations on the position of the proletariat in this, quote, catastrophic process. Indeed, if there is one area that remained obscure, insufficiently illuminated in Bordiga's investigation, it is the evolution of the relationship between state party and proletarian masses in Russia after the revolution, and more generally how this relationship fitted into the post-revolutionary state. Okay, thanks for listening. One of the things that's also missing is the question of like in none of that which just followed, with which what I just read, said anything about like the centralized impetus of towards like the militarization, like the military drive of the Stalin period, the industrialization drive that took place in the Stalin period. I don't think could be managed just merely by the self-interest of individual enterprise managers. There's no mention of like the significance of like the, quote, plan at all. There's also no mention of like the very serious problems that the Soviet Union had, which are very particular to the Soviet Union, I think, of the kind of like universal, excuse me, like the universal shoddiness of the products of their production process. And and then other people would say, one of the problems in the Soviet Union was also kind of like, which has to be accounted for, is the things like storming and overmanning. So like one of the pretty persistent features of Soviet production is there being like a lot of people employed per compared to how much machinery is being used. Right, things were fairly labor intensive, not in the sense of um, uh, like a real push for intensification of the labor process, but in the sense of just like the mechanism of like people not being able substantially in some sense, or like there being pretty severe limitations on the ability of enterprises to fire people, that kind of create a situation in which like an enterprise in a capitalism, in just like general capitalism, would have like shedded labor. They would have been like, all right, we're laying off a whole bunch of people because we cannot productively employ this many people in a profitable manner. um, that would be something that happens typically in capitalism, but that, I think, empirically did not happen often in the Soviet Union. What happened, generally speaking, was that um, um, the individual enterprises would kind of like hoard labor, right? They'd kind of like have way more people on hand because there'd be massive downtime due to like bottlenecks in like the distribution of machinery and just various things that any industrial production site needs. And there would just be a lot of people just kind of like sitting around waiting, just kind of like showing up to work and not really having anything to do, at least to my understanding of this. But they would be held on to because once the things arrived, they would kind of like storm or whatever, which is just kind of like blindly and rapidly try to establish to reach planning targets. So there's in none of the things that was just said was there any kind of like connection to like the like to like the institution of planning, or like any kind of reference to like the Sovnarkoms are really like the peasant communes or whatever, or the peasant uh, the rural peasant cooperatives. But there's no reference to things like Gosplan or storming or anything like that. Any of those kind of like, I don't know, particular features of the Soviet economy that would make it distinct from just regular old capitalism, whatever that might mean. Oh, sorry, I'm just riffing now, but thinking out loud. You have a good one.